Jared Smith of the It Is What It Is podcast, and I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. And if this is your first time listening, I just want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come rock with me as I take on a myriad of topics, as well as mix in a little bit of real estate education along the way to help you with all your real estate needs. So today, there was going to be a guest, but there's a little bit of a scheduling conflict, so my special guest is going to be on next week. So I'm still going to give you guys your real estate tip of the week. I was originally doing it by the day, but I said, you know what? If I keep saying it by the day, it would imply that there's going to be one every day, but I'm not that disciplined yet with my content. So it's going to be a real estate tip of the week, and this one is a little bit of a long one, so I'm going to kind of tie it into an overarching theme. But before we get into that, please follow my podcast page on Instagram at the_IIWII_podcast, as well as follow me on YouTube, which is Jared Smith, Jared with 2 R's, Jarred Smith, so that way you can stay up to date with all the content that I have going on, and also to network and connect, because I'm definitely open to just collaborating with anyone at this point that's willing to be on the show. So with that being said, we're gonna jump right into it. So, the reason for the suit is I like to look good, and also for my real estate tips of the day, I like to wear a suit just to give that professional image. So since this episode is going to be pretty much a giant real estate tip of the week, I decided, hey, why not look the part? So if anybody's been following my real estate content, I kind of take what's the word I'm looking for? I kind of focus on the leasing aspect of real estate. The reason for that is, one, without saying any names, that's what I do right now with my current 9 to 5. But also with the way that work in the world has been changing since the pandemic, I've noticed that a lot of people, especially in the millennial age group, are bouncing around from place to place, whether it's being relocated for work or their jobs have become 100% remote to the point where they don't have to live where they work at. So what I've noticed, at least on my side of the industry, is that a lot of people are renting now, which is not a bad thing. And I know, coming from somebody that is practicing real estate right now, everybody wants to push for people to buy and sell. Once again, if you go back to my first real estate tip of the day, you have to do what's best for you and your situation. So, with that being said, if you are in a position to where you want to invest in buying a home, whether it's to use it as an investment property or to live, to raise a family, just make sure that it is the right thing to do for you and your situation, because one of the advantages that renting has over buying is you have freedom of movement. So I'm going to tap into the, home ownership stuff down the line, but I really, really feel like that those that are in the leasing, renting community don't get a lot of love when it comes to helping educate them on the decisions that they're making. So what do I have here? What are these papers here? What is this? What is this? For confidentiality reasons, I can't show you what it is. But what do we have here? And what I have here is a lease. Now, for those that don't know what a lease is pretty much a contract that you sign to rent a piece of property or a product. So why do I have that? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is a 22-page document, and can I tell you something? From the hundreds of people that I talk to every day to eventually the thousands of people I deal with at the end of every month in my line of work, I can count on one hand how many people actually read their lease. Beyond what it takes to get their security deposit back. Of course, everybody wants to know what it takes to get their security deposit back, and, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, but we'll talk about that later. So why are we going to talk about the lease today? So your real estate tip of the week is this. Here are the 5 things. Now, of course, there's more. We're going to do a series on this, but for today, actually, instead of 5, here are the 6 things that people that are about to rent should pay attention to see is on their lease. These are the 6. That's 16. The 6 things that people need to pay attention to when they're preparing to sign their lease. Now, the reason why I pinpointed these 6 things out, like I said, that lease is about 22 pages long. But why 6? In my line of work, there are 6 common things that I've seen people miss during the leasing process that ends up being very, very expensive lessons that they end up learning down the road because their lack of knowledge in this area, they literally had to pay for it. So now everybody's lease is different. And honestly, I'm going to say this, please take notes or take note of what it is I'm going to say during these tips, because if you're overlooking a lease and you don't see these things, please talk to the real estate agent you're working with or the landlord that you're working with, whatever, to talk about these things, because the last thing you ever want to do is be trapped in a situation that's not fair because it wasn't explicitly in the lease and you signed off on it. So let's get into it. The first thing that you definitely want to take a look at when you're signing your lease is the NTV. What does NTV stand for? Notice to vacate. Now, what is the notice to vacate? The notice to vacate pretty much is your written, not verbal, not implied. It is your written decision to tell the landlord that that at the end of your lease term, you plan on vacating. Now, why is this important? Typically, with a lot of properties, they operate off of a automatic renewal clause, meaning if they don't hear from you within a certain date, they will automatically renew your lease because they cannot kick you out without you saying you want to leave. So what ends up happening is if you don't put that notice to vacate in time, your lease automatically renews. Now, what does that mean? Well, depending on the lease terms, some properties will allow you to go from what's called a month to month, which means that, okay, your lease just extends for another month. Now, at some places, in some properties, in some companies, that month to month fee may incur an extra fee, which makes it more expensive. But in some places, they actually renew your lease for an entire year. Now, what does that mean if you put in an improper notice? Well, when the lease automatically renews, you're no longer able to vacate. Well, here's the thing. You're allowed to vacate whenever you want to at that point, whether you want to leave at the end of your lease term. However, you are now financially obligated for that apartment for however long the lease says you're responsible for it. So one of the things you have to take a look for on the notice to vacate clause on the lease is at what point in time must you give that written notice? Some places operate off of 30. Some places, such as the place that I work at, and a lot of places in Philadelphia, operate off of a 60-day notice. And believe it or not, some places operate off of a 90-day notice to vacate period, meaning that those are the amount of days that you have to let your landlord know in advance, prior to your lease ending, that you plan on leaving. And honestly, you will be surprised at how many people call into me every day saying, "Hey, Jared, my lease ends next week, and I'm just letting you know that I plan on leaving at the end of the week when my lease ends." And I have to be the bad guy to tell them, well, unfortunately, your lease auto renewed, and now we have to take several steps and other contingencies for you to be able to get out when you want to get out. And honestly, it's just one of those things where you just really, really have to pay attention. So here's something that you can do to help you circumvent that. So when you're signing your lease and you find out when the notice to vacate period is, simply do this. Go into the calendar on your phone. Now, whatever your notice period was 30, 60, 90, add an extra 5 days onto that for you to, in your calendar, make a note to say, hey, think about if you're leaving. whatever. Just say, 65 days prior to, my my lease end date. So that way, listen, nobody's going to remember this off the top of their head. No one's going to remember this off the top of their head. So when you have that notice in your calendar, it could just go off. You can say, oh, shoot, I have to start thinking about if I want to renew or not. Now, I'm not going to lie. A lot of places aren't heartless to where they won't remind you. So oftentimes when you get your renewal offer, which is going to be a conversation for another day. When you get your renewal offer, it'll also remind you when you have to put your notice to vacate in. So let's just say you live at a place where they don't do that. Put that in your calendar so that way, as the time comes up, you are able to leave if that's what you plan to do without any extra costs. So NTV, notice to vacate. Before you sign that lease, that is the first thing that in addition to how much your rent is, so let's just say that is the second most important thing that you have to look for on that lease is if there's a notice to vacate clause on that lease. If there's not a notice to vacate clause on the lease, personally, I think you should not work with the landlord that doesn't have a notice to vacate clause on their lease. Or let's say that's where you want to go. Simply let the landlord know, hey, I noticed there's no notice to vacate clause on here. What's the policy regarding that? And can we get that added to the lease? Everything has to be in writing. So remember, notice to vacate. Second thing that that I think that you should be made privy to are your lease break fees. Now, what are these fees? In the event that you have to leave the apartment prior to your lease end date, that is called a lease break. And a lot of times, if not every time, to break your lease, it comes with a fee. Now, once again, convenience comes at a cost. This is actually, believe it or not, this is actually one of the perks of renting is because you can technically get out at any point in time that you want to. However, it may cost you. So what is this? Listen, life happens. Sometimes when you sign on for an apartment, it's not what you thought it would be. Sometimes you get relocated for work, which I've seen happen a lot of times. Sometimes people rent in between. Sometimes people rent when they're, trying to see what the housing market is like, and they end up finding a house and they're looking at it like, well, hey, instead of paying rent here, I could go into the home that I just purchased. Listen, whatever the reason may be, life happens. And a lot of times you may not be able to commit to a full lease term. So why do I say look for the lease break fees? If ever in the event that you have to break your lease, I think that it's imperative that you know exactly what those fees are going to cost you. So that way, if you have to make that decision, you're aware and hopefully you're financially prepared to pay those fees. So that way it won't lead into a legal and even a credit situation. Because believe it or not, if you owe a previous apartment a substantial amount of money, they can report it to the credit bureaus. So to help you just plan and have these contingencies in place in the event that life may happen and you may not be able to commit to the full lease term, look at what those lease break fees are. And honestly, this may help you determine if that's the place you want to live at or not, because believe it or not, a lot of some apartments and some properties, the lease break fees are very, very, very hefty for a good reason, because you have to look at it from the landlord's perspective. They take that unit off of the market for the amount of time in which you're there for. So if you decide that you want to leave for whatever reason, there's a lot of money that they lost because that apartment wasn't occupied and accounted for financially for the time that it was signed for. So what you want to do is take a look at what those fees are, and that may actually help you determine if that's a place you want to rent or not. Because if the fees are a very big number that you may not be able to afford and pay off in time before they report it, it may help you consider if that's a place you want to live at or not. The third thing that I think people should take a look for, I got my notes. The third thing that you should definitely want to take a look for in your lease is to see what repairs your landlord is responsible for financially. Now, believe it or not, some repairs are not, what's the word I'm trying to think? Believe it or not, Some of the repairs that you may need done throughout the time of your tenancy at a property, your landlord will not front the bill for. So, for example, I'm going to bring up an experience with mine. So, I actually clogged the sink at my apartment, and we got charged. I got charged for the fee for the plumber. It wasn't a crazy amount of money, but in my lease it states that all any plumbing issues due to the negligence of the tenant is responsible for. So I knew better than to just let food fall down the drain. So I was responsible for that. So that's definitely something that you want to keep in mind when you're looking over the leases, because a lot of places aren't as generous to foot the bill for any and every repair that has to go on, and that may affect you financially throughout your stay. So let's say whatever the issues may occur, make sure that you are aware of whatever it is that you may be responsible for financially when it comes to these repairs to help you in the long run. Because the last thing you ever want to do is just to keep adding on unaccounted for costs throughout your stay, which is going to help make you pay a lot more money in addition to your rent. Also, I want to say point 3B that you want to look for is also look for any fees and utilities that you are responsible for in addition to rent. So a lot of times when you sign on for your apartment or your house, townhome, whatever it may be, a lot of times people just think, oh, it's just the rent and that's it. Some places you're responsible for the utilities. Some places you're responsible for your trash being picked up. Sometimes there's a fee for that. Sometimes there's fees for parking. Sometimes there's tenant fees, whatever it may be. Please make sure that you look for all of the things that you are responsible financially in addition to rent, because now before you sign that lease, you now have a better idea of how much money you have to front. Oh, I just spit. Sorry, guys. You are now aware of how much more money that you are responsible for at the end of every month. So just keep those things in mind, that those are the things that you want to keep in, you want to be aware of while you're signing your lease for the things that you're financially responsible for. Repairs and additional fees on top of rent. Now, the next thing is, doesn't it sound like common sense, but you know what? We're going to go there. Please pay attention to your lease start date and your lease end date. I know that sounds absolutely ridiculous, but let me explain. In my Kevin Hart voice, let me explain. So a lot of times, one of the misconceptions that I've seen a lot of tenants experience is that they think once they sign the lease, the apartment is theirs. No, the lease is very, very detailed as to when the lease starts and when it ends. So if your lease is October, so let's say if your lease says that you are to start, that it is beginning October 25th at 12 p.m., you cannot expect or demand you get in any earlier than that, even if it was like October 25th at 11 a.m. If the landlord allows you to do anything to the apartment or even occupy the apartment prior to your lease date, it is a favor. It is an extreme consideration. So please be aware of that, so that way you can plan your movers, because believe it or not, that is the one thing that actually makes my job very, very difficult, is the fact that people don't plan accordingly. So if their lease starts October 25th, you cannot, I recommend, you can do it anything you want to, but I highly and strongly recommend that you do not get things delivered or your movers come or anything like that prior to your lease start date, because that leaves you in a situation. And then what eventually happens is, before you even get into the apartment, you already have a lot of tension with the landlord and the property when everything was spelled out in the lease. So please plan everything according to the details of when your lease starts. And I also said your lease end date. Why is that important? You have to know when your lease ends, but also it goes back to the notice to vacate. That will also give you the flag point in which you would have to base when you give your notice in the right amount of time. So that way you won't pay any additional fees. And also keep in mind that if your landlord allows you to stay past your lease date, the rent that you locked in for during your lease, your landlord no longer has to offer that to you. So eventually what can potentially happen is the rent that you're paying for the time beyond when your lease was originally supposed to end, it will now be a lot more expensive because they may be adding some extra fees on there to make up for the fact that you're still occupying the apartment after you both had agreed on the time in which you would leave. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Point number 5, rent payment procedures. Now, I know a lot of places, if you live in a very, very big complex, a lot of times they have like rent portals in which you can pay your rent on, but some places are a little bit more old school, which they still require checks. But some places, if it's like owned individually by like one landlord or anything like that, and it's not a very big property, they operate off, Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, whatever the case may be. But you definitely want to figure out how your landlord receives, how your landlord will allow you to submit your rental payments, because every place and everybody is not the same. So you definitely want to be careful. Some places don't accept checks. Some places do. I don't know if anybody accepts cash, but let's just say for the sake of the conversation, some places accept cash, some places don't. Some accept Cash App, some don't. Some accept Venmo, some don't. So you get the point. So you definitely want to know the methods in which your landlord will allow you to submit rent at. And also, a part of that, you also have to understand when your landlord wants to deems rent on time. So some places, typically it's the first of the month. In Philly, we have a 5-day grace period. So you have until the 5th to pay your rent without it being considered late. So anything after the 5th, in some places, they may consider it late. Now, I actually had a landlord in the past who gave you an additional 5 days. So you always had until the 10th to pay your rent. So you definitely want to find out what those methods and the time frames in which you're allowed to receive rent without penalty are, because that can then allow you to start planning ahead and being a little proactive on how you're going to get your rent to your landlord and when you're going to get your rent to your landlord. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Now, point I want to bring when it comes to this is quiet hours. Believe it or not, this is a thing. So a lot of apartments, because they're oftentimes a shared community, you're going to have quiet hours. Now, what are quiet hours? Does that mean you can't make absolutely no noise? Absolutely not. But these are the hours in which you have to be very, very sensitive to how much noise you make, because at that point, people can file a complaint and you could be subject to a fine or even in some places an eviction if you've been warned multiple times. So why do I say this? A lot of times, what I've noticed is that people don't see anything wrong with the way they live. And guess what? That may be the case. I'm neither judge nor jury. But when you're living when you're renting, and especially if you're living in a shared community, you have to be a little bit more sensitive, because what's noise to you may not be noise to them, and what's noise to them may not be noise to you. So the reason why I say you want to be aware of these quiet hours is that once you're aware of, oh snap, quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 10 a.m., all right, I won't play my music that loud. Believe it or not, I won't talk that loud. I actually had a complaint about that one time, that they said I was talking too loud. And a lot of times the people I see that struggle with this are the people that went from home ownership to now renting, because they've been used to living in their own rules. And hey, more power to you. But you definitely want to be very, very aware of what those quiet hours are and what they consist of, because that can definitely, knowing that can, help, like I said, help you plan and be proactive. And now I know it's very difficult if you have kids and things like that, and there's just some things that are out of your control. So definitely express that to your landlord before you sign the lease. It's like, hey, I have kids that, before they go to sleep, they like to run around a lot, and, that may conflict with the quiet hours. Or, hey, I have a pet, and, if they hear any noise or they hear something, they may start barking. So that way, once again, you can see if that's the right fit for you. And also, you're more than you might be able to hash out something with your landlord. They might be able to find you another property, or in some cases might be able to make an exception. So definitely keep that in mind when you're about to sign that lease, because the last thing you want to do is be in the middle of your lease and a lot of these issues are starting to surface and you can't really do anything about it because you have to fulfill the full lease term. So those are the 6 things that I think people that are about to rent should take a look at, especially if you're a first-time renter, believe it or not, whether it's because it's your first time being on your own or you've owned a home for so long and you kind of want to take a break from that. Definitely pay attention to those things. And I'm gonna revisit this because, like I said, leases are extensive legal documents that I think people should definitely be educated on. So we're definitely gonna revisit this. So that's your real estate tip of the week. Now, I know this is the second week we've had on the podcast without a guest, but I promise you next week, my guest and I, a very, very, very good friend of mine, we're going to delve into some man stuff. So this one, ladies, you're always more than welcome. You're always more than welcome to listen. But this one might be a little bit geared towards the fellas, and I promise you all that this is a conversation that you do not want to miss. So thank you all for giving me your time and working with me as I transition to this YouTubing. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. But you guys have definitely been making this very, very easy for me to transition to. And I just want to say thank you. So once again, my name is Jared Smith, the host of the It Is What It Is podcast, and also your friendly neighborhood real estate agent. So if you definitely want to connect with me, whether it's to hop on the podcast or any real estate advice whatsoever, especially as it pertains to renting and property management, please follow me on Instagram at _IIWII_podcast. And please follow me on YouTube at Jared Smith and like and subscribe, and also share these videos with anybody that you feel may need them. Like I said, I'm all about home ownership. I'm all about building that foundation to build equity and to usher in generational wealth for your families. But the one thing that I noticed is that there's a community of people that want to tap into it in the renting community that aren't being educated on the real estate decisions that they navigate every day by renting. And I also want this platform and podcast to really just show you not only the many different avenues of careers and passions, but also the plethora, yes, the plethora, I'm going to say it again, the plethora of ways in which you're able to tap into real estate beyond the means of just buying and selling your house. There's so many things that you're able to do, and we're going to get into that. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. And until next time.